Supreme Court cases. Today we'll be talking about multiple Supreme Court cases in history, along with explaining details about them in order to give you more information. First, we'll be talking about the case of Marbury versus Madison, which took place in 1803. When John Adams was ending his presidency in 1801, he passed laws creating new judicial posts to keep Federalists in power after he left. He also assigned his Secretary of State, John Marshall, to deliver these commissions, and because there was also a Supreme Court judge resigning, Adams made Marshall the new judge. After this, Jefferson became president. He appointed Madison as his Secretary of State, but even though it was in both of their jobs to do so, neither of them passed the commissions, and one of them was for William Marbury, which led him to sue. Now that Marbury had sued because he didn't get his commission Adams had assigned him, the Supreme Court had to make a decision. They used the Judiciary Act of 1789 and said that government officials had to perform their duties if filed. This was important because it determined that the Supreme Court can have influential decisions against the President and Congress if necessary. Marshall ended up ruling that Marbury should earn his job, and the result established the idea of jurisdiction and judicial review as listed in the Fifth Amendment. By doing this, the significance of the power of the Supreme Court was established, and again, it involved the use of the Fifth Amendment. Second, we'll be talking about the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, which took place in 2008. This case involved gun laws in DC against a police officer named Heller. He applied to have a handgun in his name but was denied due to prohibition of private handgun ownership in Washington. Heller sued saying that this law violated his Second Amendment right, and the court ruled in his favor. The significance of this case resulted in the court relating the situation to the Second Amendment by saying that there's a right to bear arms. So Heller's denial from having a handgun was wrong and violated this right. Therefore, the court established the ruling in his favor of him and his gun. Clarence Gideon was arrested for stealing a jukebox in Florida. This is the Gideon versus Wainwright case, which took place in 1963. At the time, he was sentenced to prison but was too poor to afford a lawyer. He requested one but was denied because under the laws of Florida, the court would only pay for a lawyer if he was facing the death penalty, which he wasn't. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and while there, he appealed his case and it went to the Supreme Court. He was able to argue that this violated his Sixth Amendment of requiring a court to provide a counsel, which made the Supreme Court rule that the government must provide a lawyer to anyone accused of a felony, just like Gideon. The significance of this case is that states must provide lawyers to those who can't afford one when charged with a felony, and because of it, it's now considered a right that everybody is entitled to. Next is the Miranda versus Arizona case, which took place in 1966. In 1963, Ernesto Miranda was arrested for rape and kidnapping, and after hours of questioning, Miranda confessed. However, he was never informed of his right to remain silent or the right to a lawyer if he can't afford one. He was sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. He appealed to the Supreme Court, saying he was never informed of his rights right before giving his confession. This rose questions asking if the police can interrogate a subject without informing them of their rights they have in order to prevent self-incrimination. This led to the creation of the Miranda rights, which state that the police must say these rights before interrogating a suspect. Otherwise, any self-incriminating statements or confessions cannot be used in court. The Fifth Amendment protects us from any self-incrimination, and the Sixth Amendment guarantees a person accused of a serious crime their right to an attorney, therefore leading to this case setting the idea that a police officer must mention your rights unless the person said they did cannot be used against them. Next is the Enrigal case of 1967. Enrigal is a case for Gerald Gold, as he was accused of making an obscene phone call to his neighbor. He got arrested and was sent to a children's detention home since his parents were away on a trip. This kid had many problems with it. Gerald Gold had no time to prepare for the hearing, and he didn't know his charges, his parents weren't aware, and it was a huge mess to know. On top of it, he didn't get an attorney as well. This violated his due process rights in the Fifth Amendment, and because of it, now all people are eligible for these rights, and especially the ones relating to due process. Next is the Tinker versus Des Moines School District in 1969. During the 60s, America was feeling very divided due to the ongoing Vietnam War. Because of it, students at several schools in Des Moines School District decided to wear armed black bands with peace signs to show their opposition to the war in this tragic time. However, the school didn't allow it and suspended students from school for wearing the bands, which led to the students suing. The case got to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the students since they believed it violated their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, even though they were actually students. This resulted in many people going against the court. This also let people know that all individuals have the right to freedom of speech and all other rights as long as there is a problem or there isn't a legitimate reason on why they shouldn't earn these rights. Next is the Hazelwood School District versus Kohlmeyer in 1988. After the Tinker case, there was a flourishing of student expressions. Students in a journalism class in Hazelwood East High published a newspaper on teen pregnancy and divorce. However, it got taken down because their principal had educational concerns on the topics of the newspaper. This made the students sue since they believed this violated their First Amendment right of freedom of speech and used the Tinker case as an example to support their argument. The case got to the Supreme Court, which ended up ruling in favor of the school by saying that writing in a school-sponsored newspaper wasn't the same as wearing armbands, referring to the Tinker case. Therefore, school officials were allowed to censor articles or activities if they believed it was inappropriate, which leads this case to signify and show a limit on the First Amendment right. Next is the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which took place in 1896. In the 1890s, Louisiana passed a set of laws called the Jim Crow laws, which required equal but separate rights to those of different races. However, Plessy, a mixed man, decided to test these rights by seeing how white people would react or treat Plessy if he sat in the reserved for white sections of the train. Once he mentioned that he was mixed, the conductor had him arrested. This situation got to Supreme Court, which ruled that the separation of races in that time didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that as long as all races were treated with equal standards, there would be no problem. Next is the Brown versus Board of Education case, which took place in 1954. For the next 50 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, kids continued to attend segregated schools. Linda Brown was a schoolgirl whose father sued the local school board because she was forced to attend an all-black school inconveniently since the all-white school was closer home. Even though Brown lost the case in state court, the NAACP appealed the case and took it to the Supreme Court. They argued that the system of education was unequal and was sending a message that said that black kids weren't as good enough as white kids, and it was proved through an experiment. They mentioned that this violated their 14th Amendment and that it was illegal. The court ruled in favor of Brown, and the result was that it successfully ended segregation amongst races in schools after such a long time. Next is the U.S. versus Nixon case, which took place in 1974. When Nixon was president, an incident involving a former government agent breaking into the Democratic headquarters in D.C. occurred, and Nixon, a Republican president, was trying to support and protect them from investigation. This raised curiosity on why he would be siding with them, but he claimed it was for national security. However, it came to the attention that Nixon recorded all his conversations or meetings, including the ones relating to his incident. But when asked to hear the tapes, he denied and claimed that he didn't have to do it because he had executive privilege, which according to him allowed him to deny any request as such, even for evidence, just because he was president. This was a problem because executive privilege, the privilege claimed by the president of the executive branch of government, which can allow withholding information from the public, was unknown if it should or would apply to this situation, especially since the information he denied could have been crucial evidence. However, when taken to the Supreme Court, it ruled against Nixon and made him hand over the tapes. This case showed that no one is above the law, including the president. This also became evidence and examples used against Nixon when in trial for possible impeachment later on. Lastly is the Bush versus Gore case, which took place in 2000. In the 2000 election, the results were extremely close and the decision on who would become president was unsure. The determining factor was Florida's votes that had apparently elected Bush. However, if these votes were recounted, there's a possibility that Gore could have won the election. Since at the time Bush had been elected president, he decided to put the recount on hold to stay in power. This rose questions if the Supreme Court is even allowed to stop recounts from happening since it's a state power to conduct elections. The Equal Protection Clause guarantees individuals that their ballots cannot be devalued in the Supreme Court. They ruled the recount unconstitutional, so Bush remained president.